Hello and welcome back to AmbiV. I'm Casper and today we're doing the upper control arms on the 1967 Mustang. We will be replacing the entire upper control arms on the 67 Mustang with these Scott Drake upper control arms. Originally I was just going to be doing the ball joint because the left side had been creaking occasionally after driving and there was some general odd play in it. But after doing some research and checking over and looking at these old control arms, I figured I would just replace the entire unit and guarantee that I wouldn't be replacing another piece in the very near future. So to get started, let's get this thing loose from the old ball joint. The first step in disconnecting the existing ball joint is to remove the cotter pin holding the castle nut in place. Once the cotter pin's out of the way, you can use a 7/8 inch socket to break the castle nut loose. In my case, it's already mostly loose. Once it is loose, back it down until it's near the end of the bolt, but not off. You'll want this nut to stay on here enough to catch this knuckle assembly when it falls free. Now that the castle nut has been broken loose, it is run down to the last few threads of the nut. The next step is to either knock this unit loose or pull it separate with a ball joint separator or move on to the shock. I will be moving on to disconnecting the shock. So in order to do that, I will need a 1/2 inch socket to remove the two nuts that attach it to this lower plate before moving up to the top to remove it from the car entirely. In order to remove the shock from the car, you need to remove two 1/2 inch nuts, one on the front, one on the back of this rocker plate. These 1/2 inch nuts are not particularly tight, but they're difficult to reach with a socket depending on the current orientation of your suspension. So in my case, I will be going the slow route and using a wrench. To remove the shock completely, you need to remove the two bolts that hold the shock into the cap, as well as the 3 nuts that hold the cap into the car. Now, the shock itself is held in by 1/2 inch bolts. These nuts that hold the cap on are 9/16, so you'll need a variation of sockets for this. Now, in the case of this car, in which will be similar on many cars unless you have a single piece unit, this reinforcement has to come off the bolts first. Now that the shock has been removed from the car, the next step is to compress the spring. In order to do this, we will use this little OEMTOOLS spring compressor, and I will actually use this component that normally can sit on top of the spring to go across the whole strut tower bar. That way I don't have to remove the spring from the car. Now that the spring is compressed and the shock has been removed, we can go ahead and work on separating this. As I've said before, people have good luck hitting these with a hammer and having them drop free. On this car, I have never had that happen. Not a single time that I've taken it apart. So I'm going to go straight to a ball joint separator and then potentially use a pry bar if that doesn't work. Ultimately, I don't need to preserve this ball joint, so it doesn't matter to me if it gets destroyed. Finally. As you can see, after much turmoil, I finally got this thing to drop down. So it fell loose now and it's resting on the castle nut. Now, as soon as I take the castle nut the rest of the way off, I can easily slide this off of here and it'll drop quite a bit. If you have anything around it, any appendages near it, you may want to move them before you knock it completely loose. Now this is a defective ball joint. So the next step will be to take the arm loose from the body itself on the inside of the fender. Now that the control arm's out of the car, I need to remove the spring perch to transplant to the new arm. So in order to do that, I need to remove two 9/16 bolts from either side of here. It's actually easier on the Scott Drake replacement ones to remove the nut rather than trying to pull the bolt out. So I'll be going around to the back side to pull these nuts off. When resetting the brake perch on the control arm, the part of the perch that has the spring stop generally goes to the rear. So as the spring coils down and around, this is where the spring ends, pressed up against here. Also, that prevents the spring from being able to move around once it's back in the car and under load. So on these Scott Drake units, a new cotter pin for the castle nut comes taped on here. Don't forget to pull it off before you reinstall it into the car. Otherwise, reaching this point will be a huge difficulty later on. Now that the new control arm's in place, we can go ahead and remove this castle nut and this little protector over the boot and reattach it to the spindle. thank you for watching that video. We now have 2 new upper control arms installed in the 67 Mustang. The process isn't exceptionally difficult, it can just be very time consuming and frustrating. So as with mine, the passenger side went really quickly, driver side, terrible. So set aside plenty of time to be able to tinker with it, and hopefully not a day like this where it's about 100 degrees outside and cooking me in my shop. So thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.